how do we know the account laid out in Exodus actually goes back to an historical event and is not merely a myth or a legend? Well, many biblical scholars have noted there are several internal clues that show the book of Exodus doesn't bear the markers of later forgers or myth makers, but it contains several clues that shows the account goes back to an historical people who have knowledge of the Egyptian language, customs, and culture. The probability that later forgers would get all these aspects right, if they were simply making up a legend, is highly unlikely. Benjamin Noonan points out the language used in the book of Exodus to Numbers contains a significant amount of Egyptian loanwords. There are a total of 27 different loanwords and a total of 381 occurrences. Specifically, the book of Exodus contains 26 loanwords and 333 occurrences. Outside of these three books, and within the rest of the Hebrew Bible, there are only 51 Egyptian loanwords and 450 occurrences for a much larger section of the Bible. Given the ratio of distribution, there is a much smaller proportion of Egyptian loanwords in the rest of the corpus, when compared to the books that would be expected to have more affinity with an Egyptian past. Noonan says, when one compares the above data, it becomes evident that the Exodus and wilderness traditions contains a significantly higher proportion of Egyptian loanwords than the rest of the Hebrew Bible. From the standpoint of contact linguistics, this observation indicates that the Exodus and wilderness narratives, especially the narrative of the book of Exodus, exhibit greater Egyptian influence than the remainder of the Hebrew Bible. Noonan also compares this ratio in Exodus to books written later, such as Esther, Ezra, and Nehemiah. These books have been shown to have Old Iranian influence, given that they reflect time periods of heavy Persian influence. However, Ezra and Nehemiah only contain 26 Old Iranian loanwords with 82 occurrences. The relative frequency of Egyptian loanwords in the Exodus and wilderness traditions is significantly higher than the relative frequency of Old Iranian loans in Esther and Ezra and Nehemiah. Some might argue early Canaanite cultures were heavily influenced by Egyptian intervention throughout the New Kingdom. But when we compare Hebrew to other Canaanite languages, we again find more Egyptian loanwords in the Exodus narrative than we do with other languages. There are very few Egyptian loanwords in Ugaritic and only one in Phoenician. Moabite, Ammonite, and Edomite contain no examples of known Egyptian loanwords. Old Aramaic contains 2, and as time progresses to Imperial Aramaic, you get an abundance of Egyptian loanwords. But the loanwords mostly show up in Egyptian Aramaic texts that were from Egypt. Even with that, Noonan writes, the ratio of occurrence of Egyptian loanwords to total word count, i.e. the relative frequency of Egyptian loans, is significantly higher in the Exodus and wilderness narrative than it is in Imperial Aramaic. Thus, the high amount of Egyptian loanwords in the Exodus narrative is unique with regards to regional languages within the Levant. The question, of course, is how and when did this Egyptian influence occur on the Hebrew language? Noonan argues, based on the type of some of the loanwords we find in the book of Exodus, the most likely time for linguistic borrowing to occur would be during the Middle to Late Bronze Age. Some of the loanwords in Hebrew are feminine nouns that contain a specific ending, yet this ending drops off in later times. So the most likely time for this influence to occur is during the Bronze Age, when the Bible says the Hebrews were in Egypt. Thus, the Exodus narrative contains remnants of the Egyptian language from a period of the Middle to New Kingdom. This is something that is unlikely to have happened if the ancestors of Israel had never been in Egypt. James Hoffmeyer notes many of the personal names of the Pentateuch reflect the same time period of Egypt and likely have Egyptian roots. The name Moses is most likely a Hebraized version of the Egyptian name that could have come from the structure that shows up in names like Tutmos and Ramesses. Merari, son of Levi, is only attested among the Hebrews in the Semitic world, but was a common Egyptian name of the Middle Kingdom. Phineas is also most likely an Egyptian name that means Nubian. The name Asir might derive from the god Osiris. And we can identify several other names that likely have Egyptian roots. Now, Richard Hess notes many of the names could potentially have a West Semitic origin. but West Semitic names have a strong presence in Egyptian texts from the New Kingdom. Hess also notes the names still reflect an early origin. All of these names have roots attested in the 2nd millennium BC. There is no personal name that appears only in the 1st millennium BC, and thus there is none that can be used to support the argument for the narrative being a fictional account written by scribes in the middle of the 1st millennium BC. By itself, this is a significant finding, for it affirms the names as appropriate to the time when the events of the Exodus and the surrounding narrative took place. It would be remarkable if scribes writing much later had not placed among 40 names some that were unique to their later periods and not attested in the 2nd millennium BC. Another piece of data we've already touched on, which suggests a late Bronze Age for the account of the Exodus, is the use of the name Ramesses. By the 11th century BCE, P. Ramesses was dismantled, and the stones were moved to a new capital called Tanis. The city was abandoned, and Ramesses doesn't show up in later sources to refer to Tanis. So scholars note the Exodus narrative seems to have been set before the dismantling of Ramesses. Later texts like Psalm 78 refer to the area by the 1st millennium BCE name, the Field of Zoan. The Book of Exodus does not use this later name, but refers to the city that was abandoned and lost to history. Manfred Bietek says, "This shows that the presence of the toponym Ramesses in the book of Genesis and Exodus must have been adapted from a tradition older than the 3rd Intermediate and Saite periods. The said changes in the physical and political landscape of the Eastern Delta, including new major centers and toponyms, were incorporated only later into the Bible, while the start of the itinerary in Exodus reflects the topographical conditions of the Ramesside period." So Exodus retained an older name, supporting the case the account of the Exodus goes back to memories from the 2nd millennium. Hofmeyr also notes other toponyms date back to the 19th dynasty. Pithom has most likely been identified with a site that existed in the 13th century BCE. It was named Pithom by Ramesses II. Sukkith corresponds to an Egyptian toponym that is referenced in Egyptian texts from around the same time period. Migdol refers to Egyptian forts on the Sinai Peninsula. Hofmeyr says, both the Bible and the Egyptian sources locate Migdol outside of the Delta proper. Papyrus Anastasi III, which dates to the 13th century, mentions a watery feature called the Waters of Baal, which likely corresponds with the biblical location called Baal Zephon. Another papyrus from the same time also mentions the location of Baal Zephon in the region as well. So the names of locations in the Bible align quite well with the toponyms of the region as it was known in the 13th century BCE, and not later or earlier. In fact, Donald Redford goes so far as to admit about the Exodus as a whole, the text does not look like mythology, at least on the definition of the latter as a timeless event set in the world of the gods. The biblical writer certainly thinks he is writing datable history. He also thinks it is possible to locate this event on the ground and packs his narrative with topographical detail. The Exodus is not only attested in the Pentateuch. Yair Hoffman says, the Exodus from Egypt is the most frequently mentioned event in the Old Testament. Apart from the story itself in Exodus 1-15, it is mentioned about 120 times in stories, laws, poems, psalms, historiographical writings, and prophecies. Given that the Exodus is multiply attested by numerous biblical authors, James Hofmeyr and John Bright say, there can really be little doubt that the ancestors of Israel had been slaves in Egypt and had escaped in some marvelous way. Exodus 15, also called the Song of the Sea, is considered to be one of the oldest written texts in the Bible, based on linguistics. But it has more affinity with Egyptian customs. It is ascribed to a particular voice, namely Moses, which was a more common theme in Egyptian hymns. The poetic nature of referring to God's right hand being used to destroy an enemy matches more with how Egyptian texts speak of pharaohs defeating enemies with their right arm, and more so than how the phrase is used in Akkadian or Ugaritic texts, where the right hand is portrayed exclusively as holding or grasping something. Joshua Berman points out the doublet nature of Exodus 14-15, which covers the account of the crossing of the Red Sea, is similar to what we see in the Kadesh inscription of Ramses II, where we see two accounts of the battle, a longer account and a smaller version known as the Bulletin. In other words, Exodus 14 to 15 is written in an Egyptian-like manner to preserve historical information. Both likely follow the same literary structure because they both came from a specific ancient Egyptian culture, and are both likely trying to preserve historical information. The implication is the Song of the Sea is adapting literary structure and themes from the Kadesh inscription to recount their own unique victory in the form of cultic competition. Berman says, "Consider the question of genre. Many view the Song of the Sea and the Song of Deborah as hymns of triumph. Triumph literature, such as Merneptah's Israel Stele, is unattested in the literature of Ugarit, but widespread in Egypt. Historicized narrative, in prose or in verse, is completely unattested at Ugarit. These suggest that there may have been an Egyptian literary tradition that migrated to Israelite scribal culture, and the convention of juxtaposing conflicting accounts may be part of this tradition." Furthermore, this connection with the Kadesh inscription points specifically to a Ramesside time period. Sir Alan Gardner said of the inscription, "There is nothing in Egyptian literature really comparable to this narrative of Ramses II. I maintain, therefore, that Ramses II's account of his Hittite war is a unique phenomenon in Egyptian literature." And likewise, the Song of the Sea has no strong parallel in biblical or Canaanite literature. This suggests both texts originate from a specific time period, namely the time period from which the Kadesh inscription dates to, which is the 13th century BCE. And so the Hebrews would most likely have been in Egypt during this time period to be familiar with this unique style of writing. Exodus is also familiar with Egyptian themes and customs. It refers to God's strong and mighty hand, or outstretched arm, being used to defeat Egypt, which is a common theme in Egyptian texts that often refer to the pharaoh defeating his enemies by his strong arm and power. Berman notes the use of this theme in royal titles reaches its peak during the era of the military conquest of the Thutmose and Ramesside kings of the 18th and 19th dynasties. But this terminology declines in Egypt after this period, so it is unlikely to have influenced the Hebrews after the Late Bronze Age. Another important thing to note is the pharaohs are not named in Genesis through Exodus. As unfortunate as it is that the authors never named the pharaohs in the Pentateuch, this appears to be a common Egyptian theme in the second millennium. F.J. Yurko has pointed out the pharaoh's name is often omitted in administrative documents. James Hoffmeyer said, "From its inception until the 10th century, the term pharaoh stood alone, without juxtaposed personal name. In subsequent periods, the name of the monarch was generally added. The usage of pharaoh in Genesis and Exodus does accord well with the Egyptian practice from the 15th through the 10th century." We see the same thing in the biblical texts. The pharaohs are not named in the early history, but in later texts, we see the pharaohs are named. So the books of the Pentateuch correlate with the literary practice of Egypt from the 2nd millennium BCE, whereas later texts, like the books of Kings and Chronicles, fit better with literary practices from the 1st millennium BCE. In Exodus 5, Moses does not say to the Pharaoh he came to lead Israel out of Egypt for good, but instead asks that they temporarily be released from work so they can go into the desert to sacrifice to their God. Such a request fits with the culture in Egypt from that time, and would not have been unreasonable. Inscriptions from the time of Ramses II state gangs of workers were idle for several days so they could offer to their gods, or celebrate a festival. Moses' request seemed like a clever tactic to get Ramses to agree to allow the Hebrews to go out into the desert. Hoffmeyer notes an interesting line in Exodus. It says the flax and the barley were struck down, for the barley was in the ear and the flax was in bud, but the wheat and the emmer were not struck down, for they are late in coming up. 18th dynasty paintings show that barley and flax were grown together, but wheat was typically harvested a month or so after that. So Hoffmeyer says, this attention in Exodus to the period when crops matured showed that the writer of these narratives had an excellent knowledge of the Egyptian agricultural calendar. The presence of this type of information could hardly be the guesswork of an author removed by a great amount of space and time from the events. After the children of Israel and the mixed multitude left Egypt, they were sentenced to wander in the desert for 40 years. The Pentateuch says many Israelite religious customs and rituals were laid down during this time period. If this is true, then the Israelites would have been heavily influenced by an Egyptian mentality, and most of their customs should have Egyptian markers or correlations with the 2nd millennium BCE. But if these Israelite customs were made up at a later time, then we should find more affinity to Assyrian customs or markers from the 1st millennium BCE. However, the events and customs found in Exodus through Deuteronomy do not fit with markers that would indicate a later tradition. Instead, within the Pentateuch, we find evidence of a group that had more affinity with an early Egyptian culture. Strengthening the case, what we read goes back to the culture that experienced an exodus from Egypt, as they reported. The most interesting thing that happened while Israel was in the desert was the construction of the Ark of the Covenant. But Egyptologist David Falk says, the Ark of the Covenant, as we know it from the Hebrew Bible, is steeped in the culture and context of its time. The Late Bronze Age, circa 1500 to 1200 BCE. The Ark was constructed by borrowing elements from numerous features found in Egyptian ritualistic furniture. Cultic chests appear frequently in Egyptian history and were often used for transporting sacred objects, and had long removable poles attached to the base. Often they were wood boxes covered with gold inside and out, had a sacred cloth draped over them, and had a lid with sacred statuary like the mercy seat. Yet these features are also seen in the construction of the Ark. In ancient Egypt, building shrines for the gods was very important, and often the Egyptians would construct special shrines called barks, modeled after boats. Egyptian priests would transport the idol in a bark. The Ark didn't contain an idol on top of it, but Dr. Falk notes it also contains similar features to Egyptian shrines and barks. It functioned as a shrine where God would meet with the children of Israel. The Ark is an ideal fit as ritual processional furniture and follows an Egyptian design pattern. Was the Ark a bark, a coffin, a chest, a reliquary, or a throne? Yes, and so much more. More interestingly, is the artistic features of the Ark fit with a specific time period of Egyptian history. The pair of cherubs facing each other fits with Egyptian chests from the time of Amenhotep III onward. Later, during the time of Ramses II, a type of Egyptian furniture called a palanquin throne, which was an exposed throne, often were made with winged goddesses protecting each side of the throne. However, in later times, these features fell out of fashion and were no longer used, and are also not seen in any time period before Amenhotep III. Therefore, the Ark's deconstruction and the dating of its symbols suggest the Ark was made no earlier than the reign of King Amenhotep III and no later than the end of Dynasty 20. The Ark of the Covenant fits extremely well with Egyptian ritualistic furniture customs, and specifically fits with the time period around the Ramesside dynasty. Other cultic features from the Exodus narrative also fit within Egyptian culture. When the Israelites made furniture for the tabernacle, they followed Egyptian techniques. In Exodus 27, the altar is said to have horns on it, which fits with the Egyptian description of altars from the Tutmos side period and afterwards. The altar of the tabernacle was metal laid over a wooden base. This is a common practice found among the Egyptians, who rarely made altars out of stone. In the Levant, building stone altars was the standard custom. In the biblical texts, the altar of the tabernacle was constructed in the Egyptian method. But once we see the Israelites move into Canaan, they started building altars out of stone, the standard Levantine practice. In the high priest's breastplate, we hear that there was a turquoise gemstone. A 2017 study indicated turquoise was rarely found in Mesopotamia and Canaan during the Late Bronze Age, and is virtually absent in the archaeological record of Egypt and the Near East after the 12th century BC. In fact, James Hoffmeyer notes, a survey of Babylonian and Assyrian texts indicates there was no known word for turquoise. However, the Egyptian mined the Sinai for turquoise, which lasted until P. Ramses was deserted. And the word the Hebrews used for turquoise appears to have entered their language from Egyptian prior to the first millennium BCE. Thus, the use of turquoise and the Hebrew word for it fits within Egyptian culture from prior to the abandonment of P. Ramses. Beyond this, Hofmeyr lists other Egyptian aspects for the design of the tabernacle. Many of the wooden objects, like the tent poles, were overlaid with a gold foil, which was a technique mastered in Egypt. The word for the priest's linen in the book of Exodus stems from an Egyptian loanword, suggesting an early and Egyptian origin for the priest's linen in the Exodus account. The priests also were to wear undergarments to cover their privates. Undergarments were discovered in tombs of priests in Egypt. The menorah and fire pan appear to have had some Egyptian influence, and many of the words used in describing the priest's attire seem to have come from Egyptian words. Even the encampment of Israel fits with a Ramesside time period. Ramesses' military camps were set up in a rectangular fashion, with an entrance in the middle of the eastern wall. The pharaoh resided in the middle, with a reception tent, and his throne was symbolized with two falcons facing each other, with their wings spread out. The Book of Numbers states Israel encamped in a similar fashion, with the ark in the center, which had two winged cherubs on it. The style of the encampment doesn't fit with later times, as Neo-Assyrian camps were oval-shaped. Joshua Berman says, "The military camp at Kadesh constitutes the closest parallel to the tabernacle, including the Temple of Solomon, known to date. The tent of Yahweh, the divine warrior, parallels the tent of the Pharaoh, the living Egyptian god, posed for battle." Certain practices in the timing of Israelite festivals also have more affinity with the second millennium and seem to be attempts at cultic competition within the Levant. Richard Hess notes during the end of the Bronze Age, the West Semitic city of Emmer reached its peak. When Emmer thrived in the 14th and 13th century BCE, it had a lot of influence over the Levant and the surrounding areas. Richard Hess and Kenneth Kitchen note the cultic practices and festivals at Emmer are similar to what we read in the Pentateuch, showing the Bible has cultic affinity to the late Bronze Age. Emmer 369 notes priests were anointed with oil, like what we read in Leviticus 8. Leviticus 10 notes a ritual with fire was performed that was forbidden by God. We see a similar practice at Emmer, where a torch was used to meet with a deity on the first day of the priest's installment. Hess suggests in Leviticus 10 the two rebellious priests may have been participating in a similar ritual that honored another deity. The Pentateuch talks about the differences between the priests, the sons of Aaron, and the rest of the Levites. The priests served inside the sanctuary, and the rest of the Levites did the work outside of the sanctuary. We see a similar structure in Hittite temples, where one class works inside the temple and another class works outside. The biblical punishments for infringements are also similar to what we see in Hittite and Egyptian customs during this time period. We see rituals concerning the transfer of evil to an animal and expelling them into the land. This occurs in numerous ritual documents from the ancient Near East, but the biblical version mostly resembles the older Hittite versions, not later Iron Age versions. At Emmer, the installation of a priestess took 9 days, comparable to the biblical time frame. Emmer had a festival every 7 years in autumn called Zukru that revolved around the god Dagon, which had several similarities with Israelite festivals. We can see similarities to the Passover and Festival of Unleavened Bread. Both are referred to with the same Semitic verbal root. Both required the roasting of a lamb and the hiding of the deity's face. For both, twilight is a critical time. Both require a 7-day sequence and began on the 15th day of the first month. Both bring out holy relics for an important meal and special bread and drink, and with an important focus on family. Zukru as a ritual where oil and blood are rubbed on stones. Similar to the biblical feast, Hess says, the only other example of anointing with both blood and oil is found in the installation of the priest in Leviticus 8:30. Another text from Emmer is a ritual calendar that has several similarities to Israelite festivals, which are found in Leviticus 23. First, both calendars reflect more interest in one half of the year, focusing on spring and autumn. Both calendars use the name of the month as the primary means of identifying the month and how the text is organized. For the first and last month, Leviticus 23 identifies the ritual actions that occurred by introducing each one with a phrase that includes the paid preposition, the number of the days, and the word for month. Parallels can be found in the ritualistic calendar found at Emmer, as well as in other Akkadian and Ugaritic calendars. Hess says, "The biblical Feast of Weeks that occurs in the middle of the calendar resembles the description of the Emmer festivals during the months of Anna. In both cases, these are intermediate, occurring between major festivals at the beginning and the end of the calendar. In both cases, specifics as to the particular day of the month are missing. Therefore, it seems unlikely that a single standard formula can be identified for introducing calendar festivals. The Emmer calendar demonstrates that such variation by itself does not prove a later editorial innovation." Emmer Zukru festival had rituals and timing that were similar to the Israelite Feast of Booths. Although Zukru was only once every 7 years, Daniel Fleming notes it was also a 7-day interval with special attention to the first and last day. Both also occur on the 15th day of the month. In its 7th-year cycle, the timing of the Zukru matches exactly the covenant renewal of the Feast of Booths, prescribed for Israel in Deuteronomy 31. In Leviticus 23, there are 2 descriptions of the feast, with different actions that were to occur. Some argue this is evidence of different sources combined into one, or that a later addition was added in. But at Emmer, we have different rituals that were performed during parallel periods. Richard Hess says, "In both ritual calendars, the differences in various details are matched by parallel periods of time when the feasts were celebrated, and by similar general actions during the holidays. The similarities suggest that a second description of a ritual occurring on the same day or days as the first, and positioned soon after the first description in a text, does not by itself indicate that it is an editorial addition." Next, Leviticus 23 varies in how much detail is given to explaining each feast. The same is true for the ritual calendar at Emmer. Some feasts are only mentioned in a single line, and a lot of details given to others. Both calendars are uneven in how much detail is given to each festival. Emmer also had a festival in the spring dedicated to the warrior and storm god Baal, which occurred at the same time as Passover. Passover also associates the God of Israel with a warrior persona who fought against Egypt and delivered Israel from slavery. Now, despite the similarities, we have to note there are also a lot of differences between the biblical festivals and the festivals at Emmer. However, the similarities suggest they emerge from the same type of culture and time period. Daniel Fleming puts it like this: "The similarities can be accounted for in part by the regional culture shared north and south along the route between Haran and Hebron. Israel was establishing itself as a distinct people during its wandering period, and was getting ready to move into Canaan. So they seem to have established festivals to compete with pagan celebrations, and drew from the same cultural context, as well as drawing from their own history. New religious expressions almost always draw from a pool of ideas that are already in the culture. In other words, Israel may have repurposed older pagan rituals to align with their own history and important events that define them as a nation. Nevertheless, the Israelite festivals, established during the Exodus and wandering period, fit with cultic competition from the end of the second millennium, and not during the period of the first millennium. Richard Hess puts it like this: "Whatever the dating of the final form of Leviticus 23, as we now have it, and whatever concerns may have shaped it over time, this multi-level collection of similarities in form and content between Emmer 446 and Leviticus 23 demonstrates a heritage of the cultic calendar and rituals of Leviticus that predates the first millennium BC. Indeed, this type of text and some of its special days, with their rituals, have a heritage that reaches back to the late Bronze Age." Apart from the religious aspects, we also see the covenantal formulas in the Pentateuch match with the same time period. Within the Pentateuch, God establishes his covenant with Israel, and it is written in the fashion of a suzerain treaty, which means Israel had become the vassal of God. It has often been argued the covenant of the Pentateuch fits with a later Assyrian culture. but Kenneth Kitchen has surveyed the treaties from the ancient Near East and notes the way the covenant is formulated in the Pentateuch and Joshua aligns far better with how late Bronze Age Hittite treaties were designed. The opening line in the Book of the Covenant, which contains the Ten Commandments, contains a specific introductory formula that is employed in ancient Near Eastern treaty texts from the middle to late 2nd millennium BCE. Both begin with a title, then are followed by a prologue, stipulations, depositions, witnesses, and then blessings and curses. Later Assyrian treaties lack the historical prologue, no blessings to match the curse section, and no deposition section. Kitchen says that these treaties belong squarely within 1400 to 1200 and at no other date. The impartial and very extensive evidence, 30 Hittite-inspired documents and versions, sets this matter beyond any further dispute. It is not my creation, it is inherent in the mass of original documents themselves and cannot be gainsaid if the brute facts are to be respected. Victor Hamilton points out that some of the laws of the Pentateuch demonstrate an almost word-for-word correspondence with some of the legal works from the 2nd millennium BCE, suggesting a template existed for these types of documents. Brevard Child says, more than half of the Covenant's code's provisions have some parallel in one or more of the cuneiform codes, whether in the form of the same problem addressed or distinctions applied, a similar rule or an identical rule. Some note the 3 recitations of the covenantal treaty between Israel and Yahweh vary between each other, but minor variations also appear among the Hittite treaties from the same time period. The main outline is present in all, demonstrating cultural affinity with the biblical texts. The Pentateuch also shares symptomatic details with late 2nd millennium treaties. The use of the term bond only before the blessings and curses, followed by the use of the joint expression for bond and oath, is a 2nd millennium feature not found in later treaties. The term for treasured possession is found within other texts from the 2nd millennium. The phrase guard the covenant can also be found in documents from the same time. So many linguistic features seem to fit better with the time period of the Bronze Age. Another important issue concerning these treaties is the genre implies the authors were trying to record history and not craft a mythology. Dilbert Hillers pointed out the ancient treaties that used this structure were based on historical events to create a real sense of obligation. The history is the basis for your obligation. Parenthetically, if the history were to create any sense of obligation, it had to be substantially accurate. Thus implying, within the ancient Near Eastern culture, the treaties of the Pentateuch and Joshua were understood as built on historical events, not mythological creations, challenging the theory that the authors never intended to write actual history when they were writing down the account of the Exodus. Kitchen notes the fact that the Pentateuch contains these complex features not only points to a time period when the biblical Exodus occurred, but also that the corpus could not possibly have been reinvented even in the 14th, 13th centuries by a runaway rabble of brick-making slaves under some uncouth leader, no more educated than themselves. In short, to explain what exists in our Hebrew documents, we need a Hebrew leader who had had experience of life at the Egyptian court, mainly in the East Delta, hence at P. Ramesses, including knowledge of treaty-type documents in their format, as well as of traditional Semitic legal social usage, more familiar to his own folk. In other words, somebody distressingly like that old hero of biblical tradition, Moses, is badly needed at this point to make any sense of the situation as we have it. Essentially, the complexity of the Pentateuch points to an affinity with the late 2nd millennium, but also an author or group of authors who would have been familiar with treaties and religious texts of that time. This makes a Moses figure a likely explanation. Now, this obviously doesn't prove the existence of the biblical Moses, but it probabilistically can raise the case that a Moses figure existed, who would have had an education at the Egyptian court and who would have been familiar with the documents of that time. During this time period, the Egyptians had a lot of interaction with the Hittites, so the Hittite comparisons with the biblical texts also aid the case for the historical Moses and Exodus. Additionally, when we look at the protest movements of the late Bronze Age, we see their structure and methods are similar to the Exodus. During the reign of Ramses III, the workers of Deir el-Medina went on strike to protest unfair treatment from the ruling class. But they didn't elect a representative from the workers. Instead, a Magi, who would have had access to the court in Thebes, became the representative, because he could obtain an audience with the court, given his position. Likewise, a Moses figure is necessary for the Exodus account, as to get access to the Pharaoh, someone would have to have had standing with the royal court, like the son of a daughter of a Pharaoh, so the Hebrews could voice their complaints through him. So a Moses-like figure fits with the cultural context of protest movements from that time period. Besides this, as we went over, we do have a wealth of internal evidence that supports the Exodus narrative. As we noted in Exodus Rediscovered, the amount of Egyptian loanwords in Exodus through Numbers is significant enough to suggest a connection with Egypt. Not only do other languages within the Levant lack this amount of Egyptian loanwords, but later biblical texts also lack such a high percentage of loanwords, with the languages they would have more affinity with. The names within the Pentateuch do not suggest the mark of later forgers, but have affinity with Egyptian names and West Semitic names from the 2nd millennium BCE. And the book of Exodus has knowledge of the Egyptian culture and customs that authors from the 1st millennium would have been unlikely to know about. Additionally, now we see that the construction of the Ark and the Tabernacle came from a people who would have had extensive knowledge of Egyptian religious customs. The cultic and religious festivals fit with the culture of the Late Bronze Age, and the formations of the biblical covenant align with Hittite treaties from the same time. This extensive knowledge of Egypt and the culture of the Levant from the 2nd millennium doesn't bear the mark of late forgers, but reads like an historical account that came from a people group that left Egypt as Exodus records. Individually, none of these points would amount to much, but combined, they make a strong case the Exodus is an historical account that goes back to a time that Israel had extensive knowledge of the Egyptian language, culture, and customs. If this account was all a fabrication, it is unlikely the book of Exodus would coincidentally contain all these affinities with an early Egyptian culture. However, if the Exodus is an accurate historical account, this is what we should expect to find, meaning the evidence suggests the Exodus has many internal clues that do not bear the mark of later forgers or mythmakers. The internal evidence of the Pentateuch is better explained if the Exodus is based on an historical account that was recorded and handed down to their descendants in Israel.